A useful technique for collecting primary data is called observation. Observation is when you plan how you're going to watch, record, analyze, and interpret behaviors and events. Observation typically involves going out into what we call the field, which is anywhere you find people in their natural environments. This could be in a factory, going to the grocery store, or just sitting in the corner of a coffee shop, recording how many people are served within an hour. When observing, your goal is to describe what's happening and then analyze the results. We actually looked at an example of observation earlier when we talked about ethnography, when we saw a video of people using a Xerox photocopier, and that observation could actually be used to discover problems with the photocopier in terms of understanding how it was operated. Other examples could include like working in a plant to study factory life or observing in-store shopping behavior of customers with a camera in a grocery store. The main advantage of observation is that you can actually gather data about people's behavior without having to directly ask them questions. Sometimes directly asking questions can be a problem, like if people say they're too busy to answer your questions, maybe for example, a busy executive, or when they have a problem answering the questions. For example, children. Sometimes watching children can be better than asking them questions because their attention span might not be that high and they might not always be 100% reliable or honest depending on their age when asking them questions. When you're observing, it's also possible to look for other factors that have an impact on people, like things even like seating or weather or the day of the week it is, that could have an impact on what's happening. Disadvantages of observation are that it is very time consuming because to see everything you need to, often you have to observe for very long periods, and bias can be easily introduced because subjects knowing they are being watched can change their behavior, and the researcher might start to form opinions of people, which can also introduce bias. In order to do good observation, we have 4 main characteristics of observation that you need to make decisions on: control, group membership, structure, and concealment. We're going to look at each of these in detail in this video. The first factor is control. Control refers to whether observation is conducted in an artificial or a natural setting. It's most common to conduct observation in the natural setting. However, you can use a controlled environment in some experiments. Controlled observation just means when you have carefully arranged conditions, like in the case of an experiment, whereas uncontrolled methods makes no attempt to control, manipulate, or influence a situation. Some examples of observational studies that have high control are ones that can be conducted in a lab or an experiment, and some factors you can control are things like getting people to look at different layouts of products on grocery store shelves. So you'd make different shelves with different arrangements of products and see which ones people gravitate to and buy. Different labor conditions for different employees, like maybe you try making them work in different temperatures or with different lighting. Or time pressure for different investments. Does the time you have to decide influence decisions financially? The goal of the researcher would then be able to see if different behaviors if there's different behaviors of the people based on these conditions. When you do uncontrolled observation, you make no attempt to control what's happening and just let events run their natural course and the researcher does not interfere. This is most common, so imagine you're at a coffee shop and you're just counting the number of people that come in and out. If you're not doing anything to interfere with the situation, that would be uncontrolled observation. This observation is ideal for seeing how subjects behave in their natural environment, but it is difficult to determine why people behave the way they do because you're not controlling any factors. You have to control things like using experiments to be able to make those connections to say one thing causes another to happen. Also, in the video that I made you watch on page 1 of the lesson, that's uncontrolled observation because you can't influence the situation in any way. It already happened and we just have a video recording of the busy street where it looks like there's some kind of event going on. The second factor to make a decision on is group membership. Group membership means whether the observer, so the researcher, is a member of the group that's being observed or not. Non-participant observation means that the researcher is never directly involved and they're not a member of the group. Usually this would be if you're observing through a camera or a one-way mirror. So for a camera, it's like the video recording of the busy street or the video recording of the people using the photocopier. You never get involved, but you can see what they're doing. Or you could think about like when you have somebody in an interrogation room and cops are watching through one-way glass or lawyers are watching through one-way glass and they're not directly involved or talking to the person. However, more commonly, the researcher is involved in some way. That's called participant observation, and it can vary. So the lowest level is passive participant observation. This is when the researcher collects data without being part of the organizational system. So that's my example of sitting in the corner of a coffee shop and just recording people's behaviors and what they're buying and when they're coming and going. Moderate participation is the researcher does not actively participate with the subjects, but they could still ask them questions. So for example, if you're not familiar with the activity someone's doing or the terms that they're using, you could ask them questions, but you're not directly interfering in the people's work or in their comings and goings or daily life. In active participation, the researcher engages in everything that the groups under subject are doing. So they might participate in meetings or other daily activities of employees at an office, but they're not a direct employee. They're still in the role of the researcher. Whereas in complete participation, the highest level, the researcher becomes a member of the social group under study. So this one you could almost think of like undercover boss or like being a spy and going undercover, that the researcher actually becomes an employee so they can see what would happen from an insider's point of view. There's famous examples of this when researchers join like production lines for making cars and things like that, where they actually worked on the line to know what was happening with those people. The third thing you need to make a decision on is structure. What structure refers to is basically if you have a clear plan going in, so how focused, predetermined, systematic, and quantitative in nature the study is. If you use what's called structured observation, it's generally quantitative in nature. That just means you know which categories or activities you're planning to study. So examples could be that you're going to go into a fast food restaurant and record how long it takes people to get into their meal. You're going to go into a coffee shop and see how many customers are served in an hour. You're going to go into a factory and record environmental conditions like the temperature, lighting, and humidity, and changes in those settings. So the behaviors of people and how they're feeling or communication could also be recorded in field notes. However, if you have a plan on what specific things you want to look for in terms of how people are behaving and acting, it's still structured observation. When there is no plan in advance, you have unstructured observation. This is actually more difficult because you need to record practically everything you see, and this is what's called qualitative in nature because you're looking for qualities rather than specific numbers. So based on what is observed in a structured observation, you can try to look for things you might want to study in the future. So any interesting relationships or patterns that you notice. In that first video that I provided of the busy street, that was an unstructured observation because I just told you to watch the video with no clear goals. Just asked you, what do you think is happening based on what you see? Finally, the last step is concealment. Concealment refers to if the subjects know they're being observed or not. Concealed observation means that the people being observed are not told they're being observed. An advantage of this is that their behavior is not influenced. However, it's important to consider if this is ethical because you don't have their consent in advance for observing them, and this could violate privacy or confidentiality. So researchers need to carefully assess whether they should try to use concealed observation, basically be like that undercover spy. A good guideline is that the research plan should be able to justify why it's important to those involved in the study as well as the scientific community at large. Unconcealed observation means that the people know they're being studied, but there's well-documented evidence that if people know they're being studied, it will influence their behavior. There's a famous example called the Hawthorne effect, where in an assembly line, people were told that they were being observed in order to see if different factors like increased lighting would increase their productivity, but it turned out that just because the people knew they were being watched for an experiment, that made them more productive, whether they changed the lighting, humidity, or other things. And that's what's called the Hawthorne effect. Just being watched made people more productive. In the video of the people on the street that I asked you to watch on page 1, the people probably don't really realize that they're being recorded, so it's likely concealed observation. Please make sure you try the learning check questions at the end of the lesson in order to practice telling the difference between these 4 conditions for good observation.